Still with us, trial attorney Christa Ramey. Christa, how much difference does his testifying against Lynn Lee, who has now been convicted, make in terms of what kind of sentence he might get?
Well, I think that the sentence is now baked in the cake, if you will. He knew that he was going to get a reduced sentence when agreeing to testify, and that was part of that agreement in order to testify. And it was part of the cross-examination at trial, as we heard. It was talked about in the direct as well. So I think that he probably already knows what his sentence will be before the judge gives it to him later today.
Let's talk a little bit about that, though, because when I was on the bench, sometimes there was a misconception, and that misconception was this: under the laws in the state of Georgia, where I was presiding, that if the prosecution and the defense agreed on a sentence, for instance, after a conviction, that the judge would say, okay, you've agreed to it, that's within the guidelines, that's within the law, so let's say that's a good sentence. But the reality is the judge has the responsibility to make certain that it's fair, that it's equitable, that the judge agrees based on all the circumstances. So is it true or not that even if he's agreed to a sentence between the prosecution and the defense, that the judge may have some discretion to either bless that or say, I'm going to do different?
Absolutely. I mean, the judge heard, it was the 13th juror, if you will, in the case, and listened to the evidence and heard everything that happened, and probably is well aware of the testimony that he gave, which was inconsistent, by the way, than what we believe to happened in his case, where he was convicted as the actual trigger man, I believe, in his trial. And he said during the course of Lynn Lee's trial that she was the one that pulled the trigger with his gun. So there is some inconsistencies. The judge might say, based upon this, I'm not sure that he was being truthful in this, in providing this evidence. And it might have been a little self-serving. So the judge might take that into account when determining what the sentence is, of course.
Has that happened to you, Christa, or have you had situations or circumstances where it all seems like a reasonable deal that perhaps you've reached out, but it falls apart once you get before the court?
Well, sure. I mean, it happens both in criminal cases and in civil cases. We think we have everything plotted out exactly how our judge, who we know who our judge is, so we make sure that we're taking into account what our judge, would agree to. Certainly. But of course, always there's things that could happen that we didn't foresee. And the judge might, disagree with what our, assessment of the situation is in terms of the sentencing or, settlement agreement in the case of civil cases. So the judge always has broad discretion, which, by the way, is very seldom turned over on appeal. And so the judge, will, take into account what the attorneys have agreed upon, of course, but that can change if the judge sees things differently.
And that's what I love about court TV, and that we have cameras in the courtroom, because you really don't know what might happen or what to expect. Because to your point, I noticed too, his testimony was different in his own trial versus that of Lynn Lee Rennick.